thanks for that and all the great speakers today. This has really been an inspiration to me. I'm going to take a little bit different track today about some human dimensions of things. My name is Jeff Broberg. I'm a licensed professional geologist. I retired from corporate life about a year and a half ago, and I went back to school. And I took a different track. I'm getting a master's degree in philanthropy and nonprofit development, and I've been exposed to social work and social dimensions that I had never considered in my life. I look up words every day now, and it's shown me a key to one of the things we're missing, I think, in dealing with environmental advocacy. We're not even giving ourselves the language to talk about how we address the barriers and motivators that bring people together. I've started a new nonprofit organization, the Minnesota Well Owners Organization. Our goal and purpose is to represent the interest of private well owners and make sure everybody has safe water. We want people to look at the water at their tap, take well tests, and understand what that means to their health, their well systems, and their aquifers. So I'm going to show you today some of the things that I've been working on. One of the first things I did was a literature review of surveys of well owners across the country. I found 35 papers in the last 5 years that were surveys of well owners across the country, and I found a number of paradoxes. It was interesting that only half of people report testing their well once every 10 years. And even in areas where groundwater contamination is certain, there's large areas of the country where arsenic is a problem in the water. And still people don't test their water. And even when they do, oftentimes they don't do anything about it. And I couldn't understand why this is. And I go to a lot of meetings about water. And I'm faced constantly with the paradox of people standing up and saying, well, I would never contaminate my own groundwater. And the paradox is that the people that are most impacted are the ones having the most impact. And I didn't understand why this is. So you start looking into this, and there's been a lot of work that works on this. Josephine Marcotti, who has just recently left the Star Tribune, did a great series of articles, Water Pressure. Series, about a baby that died from nitrate poisoning in Wisconsin. A brewery town running out of water, and the need for the Lewis and Clark water system. And all of these were community problems that were often faced on biases and problems that people weren't really addressing, and even as they were being interviewed in these reports, weren't recognizing what the problems were. And I feel throughout my career as a geologist, I've been one of these scientific talking heads for 30 years. And I have not been addressing the things that are motivating people and the barriers and things that create these problems. And when I start looking into the motivational, the behavioral biases, the things that form people's judgments, I'm starting to see the things that are creating the problems. No amount of facts will convince some people. And as a scientist, that's confounding. You can't believe that that's true. And I go to scientific conferences all the time, and we talk all day long about, well, these are the facts. Understand this, and you'll come to the right decision. But we don't. And I started making a list of the biases that affect people with water. Wiki has a good list of behavioral biases. They list 116 common decision-making biases. And it's interesting because some of these are motivators and some of them are barriers. But they all affect how we think, how we remember things, what we believe, and things that we run into in water are oftentimes the very most difficult things to deal with. The illusion of control. I mean, people have a really funny attitude about what they really have control of. I don't know if you read the New York Times. Paul Krugman this last week had an article about rural America and the decline of rural America. And his thesis was that the farmers, the people that are in charge of the land, aren't in control. This is an economic system that is driving things, and yet people have the illusion that they're under control. And that's a hard bias to break. The illusion of truth. How many times have I seen people in public presentations make faulty claims and people believe it because somebody with purported authority said it's true? This is a common problem in environmental work, that the first person with apparent authority that makes a claim, everybody else has to respond to it. Whether that claim is true or not, the first person who makes a claim, everybody else has to respond. Information biases of all kinds. Hostile attribution biases. This is a toxic one, where people impart a hostile intent on you by having an opinion. I see this, scientists suffering this all of the time, and it's not true. And one of the more interesting ones is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and this is one I want to talk about in a little more detail because it's a confounding one that there's been a lot of work in the last years. The Dunning-Kruger effect is a problem with self-assessment, and it basically states that incompetent people lack the skills to improve because they can't distinguish between competency and incompetency. This happens all the time. It's a mismatch of your self-assessment. And it came out of tests out of Princeton University years ago where they would give students a test, and before they gave them the grades, they would ask them how they thought they did on the test. And invariably they found that the people in the lowest quartile that scored the lowest assessed themselves to be in the highest quartile. And the people that were in the highest quartile invariably assessed themselves lower. And how could this be true? So they continued to do these tests, and they found that they had a hard time even correcting this. That they thought, well, maybe by showing the people in these highest and lowest quartile, asking them to grade everybody's test, they would gain a sense of where they were stacked up in the crowd. Retested people, once again, the lowest quartile still placed themselves in the highest quartile, even though they had seen everybody's answer. This is not like choosing a softball team in grade school, where you kind of know where you stand in your ability because it's publicly stated. We aren't faced with being criticized and corrected when we're wrong. The problem is, by not receiving that negative impact from competent people, we continue to fail. And I see this all the time. I see people that purport themselves to be water experts, and they say things that are crazy wrong, and you can't change their opinions. They're unable to spot their own competency. What they found is that it wasn't until they gave people training about logic and how you tell whether or not you're right or wrong that you can adjust people's attitude, and you need that constant correction. Just taking and failing tests all the time, you could still continue to believe that you're in the upper quartile. So there's a lot of people we run into in these environmental forums that think they're kind of the smartest people in the crowd, but they might have the least amount of competency, and they're not even able to assess who in the room is the most competent. And how many people in this room have seen that happen? I'm sure it happens all the time. It really goes to the point of whether you can really have student-directed learning. You need a coach. You need someone that can correct you. And once you get to a stage in your adult life, this becomes more complicated. They found that this effect is also most solid in ego-inducing environments. So if it's in a public forum, people will get up and say, I know this is true. I know I'm not contaminating my water. They don't know enough to have an opinion of where they fit in the scale in their own competency. Neurobiology is another thing. This is fundamental brain chemistry, and this is something I never looked at through my entire life, but there's some very interesting things going on with neuroscientists who are devising very clever experiments, and they put people in a functional MRI to tell which part of their brain lights up at what time, and what are the things that trigger brain activities. And the fundamentals are, there's a pleasure, a fear, a flight responses in parts of your brain that are fairly easy to detect. And one of the more clever experiments I saw was a group that wanted to figure out how true this was with groups that were really diametrically opposed. They were us and them crowds, and they chose Yankees fans and Red Sox fans, notorious for not getting along. And they wanted people that knew baseball, they knew the players, and they put them in this MRI machine and showed them a baseball game. And the Yankees fans, if the Yankees did good, they were expecting the pleasure center to shine. And they expected if the Yankees fans and the Boston did good, that pleasure center would turn off. But they found something completely surprising, that when you're in these diametrically opposed positions and you're a Yankees fan and the Red Sox do good, it creates aggression. It creates an aggression response in your mind. And I see this in tribalism all the time, in these us versus them environments, where people are faced with these diametrically opposed positions. And they did a really clever test. They put these same people in the MRI and they showed them a game with the Baltimore Orioles. And their original hypothesis was true. The pleasure center was either on or off. It didn't create aggression. It was only among those groups that were the us versus them that triggered the aggression. So the question is, how do we address these things when we're in a political environment? Or how do we address them in environmental advocacy? And it's something we have to first recognize, and we have to first be able to talk about. Another really interesting study that I wanted to bring up was about values. And again, as a geologist, this is not something that I ever looked at before. But I had looked at a research article from 1983, from Second Farm Crisis approximately. And it was an assessment of small farmers and the changes in small farms out west. And the notion was that small farmers were in a place where they were having to change. They either had to get an off-farm job or some other income support, or change their farming style to be something that was a larger, more commodity-based system. And they were asking people about their values. And they found something that was very similar to what my farm was like when I bought it in 1986. My farmer rented, he grew 5 crops, and he knew everybody he sold every crop to. And shortly thereafter, he had to get a job, over-the-road trucking, and pretty soon it was more profitable for him to truck than it was to farm, and my next renters were commodity farmers. And those commodity farmers were totally growing corn and soybeans, 2 crops in a rotation and selling into the market. But what they found in the value assessment is the people that were on the small farm paradigm valued family, and they valued community, and they valued their farms as a place to live. And the people that had converted to the commodity farms valued productivity and efficiency, that were totally selfish pursuits. They were not community values. And the hypothesis, and much discussion in years after, of these papers were that we were going to see a decline in community values as we transition to these commodity farms. And that has been my exact experience in farming in southeastern Minnesota. So where does that bring us with private well owners and the task at hand? I should say first that our group's organization goal is to increase well testing by a factor of 4 in Minnesota in the next 5 years. We think that the entry level to caring about your water and what happens to it has to start at your faucet by having a good well test and understanding what that means. And there are many more barriers than there are motivators. There are so few motivators that they're oftentimes related just to a place in life. They're related to a pregnancy or a child in the home, or the sale of a property or the value of a property. And there are few other motivators that get people to test their wells. Knowledge, risk perception, these are things that will drive people. If they sense there's a risk about their water, they might test it. But convenience, the Ag Department has just done this large well testing throughout Minnesota where they have sent everybody a free well test. Send it in the mail, you fill it up and send it back, and their return rate is about 30%. Even though it's extremely convenient, people aren't availing themselves to that. In the 3M contamination area, where large areas are known to have contaminated groundwater, there's 5,000 private wells in the Woodbury, Lake Elmo area that have the 3M chemicals in the water. They go door to door and ask people to test their wells, and they say, if we find the chemicals, you can have free water treatment for the rest of your life. And only half of the people avail themselves. And I go to those meetings, and I try to understand what's going on, and I hear all of these barriers. Well, I hate 3M. I don't like the health department. I don't like the PCA. And even though they're facing a health risk, and then I see why. An individual about my age stood up and he said, I'm part of the biologic testing program and these chemicals are in my body. What should I do? And the health department's answer is, that's between you and your doctor and your attorney. That gives them no confidence. And there's nothing that is giving them a motivator to test their wells. So how do we deal with these and the social factors? The barriers are so many. The list is 40 or 50 things long about what are the barriers. And uncertainty or lack of knowledge. And, I talked to the health department about this and even the testing labs. And the well tests are perfectly understandable to me. They say what the analytes are, what the values are, what the limits are you above or below? They'll even often tell you what to do. But you start a conversation about what is the anion level of the water, and you've totally lost people. So we're not addressing people where they live, and we're not giving them the advice about where they can find the information, practical information about what to do. Complacency is a powerful bias. And people don't often think of it as a bias, but it drives people to inaction. And it's something that we don't know how to address. And we're finding many other things that are barriers. And we find many of these biases that have surprised me. Studies in Minnesota and Wisconsin have found a huge gender bias over water. In general, men in rural areas don't care about the water. The women do. So we're talking to the wrong people all the time about what it is we need to do to protect our water. And when we look at how we address this, this is our challenge at the association or our organization. we're not sure we can do this a well at a time. There's 472,000 private wells in Minnesota in 6 groundwater provinces that each of them have a different groundwater challenge. Where I live in the southeast, it's the karst and the rapid infiltration of almost anything at the surface. I have a well that's 400 feet deep. It has 22 parts per million nitrates, over twice the health risk limit. My neighbor's well is 500 feet deep, and it has 8 parts per million. It would not do me any good to drill a $35,000 well to have contaminated water. So the practical advice is that water treatment is the best option. But people jump to the conclusion that they're going to have to drill a new well. And we're seeing oftentimes the movement towards public water supply systems. Hugely expensive. Josephine Marcotti's article was much about that, sulfates in water, and having to bring water across a continental divide to solve these problems. And we're not addressing the problems that we've listed here. So there are some places that give us some hope, I think. David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times, is part of the Aspen Institute, and he started the Weave Social Fabric Project. And I'd advise you to take a look at this because they're really centering on what it is we can do in rural America and America in general to create this cohesion and weave ourselves together. In his article from just March 21st, just this week, I'm going to read a part of it because I thought it was particularly poignant. It said, everybody says rural America is collapsing, but I keep going to places with more moral coherence and social commitment than we have in booming urban areas. These visits prompt the same question: how can we spread the civic mindset that they have in abundance? For example, I spent a week in Nebraska in towns like McCook and Grand Island. These places are not rich. Many of the schools, 50% of the students receive free or reduced cost lunch, but they don't have the pathologies we associate with poverty. Nearly everybody's working at something. Nebraska has the 6th lowest employment rate among the 50 states. It has the 12th longest life expectancy. Some of the high schools have 98% graduation rates. It ranks 7th among the states with intact family structure. Crime is low. Many people leave their homes and cars unlocked. One woman I met came home and she noticed her bedroom light was on. She thought it was her husband home early, but it was her plumber. She'd mentioned at the coffee shop that she had a clogged sink. So he swung around, let himself in, and fixed it. When she needs some auto work done, she leaves a blank check on the front seat of the car. The town mechanic comes by when he can, drives the car to his garage, does the work, and fills out the check. Nebraska ranks 8th in the country for social capital. McCook has only 7,700 residents, but it has a Rotary Club, a 4-H club, a Future Farmers group, a music festival, a storytelling festival, a chapter of the Nebraska Community Foundation, churches, libraries, museums, and on and on. It's a wonderful story of where I live, but I don't see a community around water. And I don't know why. And it has to be embedded in these biases and the perception of the barriers that we need to be working together to fix. So I think the advice of the Weave project is choose happiness and be grateful. And the most important lesson we've learned at the Well organization is if you have good water, be grateful and tell people. We think it should be something like an I voted button to create community. And if it's not good water, reach out to your neighbors like they do in Nebraska and say, help me. I ended early. That's all I have. Thank you. Any questions? David?
Could you comment on the Brown County?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Right. What David is talking about is the Ag Department has the program to provide free water testing to people in what they determine to be high-risk townships. And in Brown County, they came to the decision that they were going to reject the grant to do the free water testing. And that even in light of the fact that one of the Brown County commissioners had a brother that died of blue baby syndrome as an infant in 1954. I talked to the people over there. We went and visited, and we gave a presentation in Brown County about encouraging them to do the testing. And what we found was that the narrative had changed about the reason for the water testing. The Ag Department had originally started this to talk to people about having safe water, and the narrative changed to be water testing to regulate agriculture. And the narrative totally got out of control of the Ag Department. And when I talked to David, the commissioner, he said that he came to the meeting that day and he thought it was going to be a done deal. He had his packet and he thought it sounded like a good deal. It was free water testing. Everybody should welcome that. And they're very careful about not talking about these things before the meeting. And he walked in with the chairman, and Dave said to the chairman, he said, well, this should be an easy thing, shouldn't it? And he said, well, we'll see about that. On my way over to the meeting that day, I had called a friend that works at the DNR, and I said, what am I going to run into at this meeting I was invited to? And he said, well, it's like this. We joke about it at the DNR that when we have a water meeting, we have to have 8 donuts. There's 8 lobbyists that show up that say, why are you always picking on agriculture? And he said, you're going to run into these. And he named them. I knew 4 of them. And 4 of them showed up at the meeting. And it developed into this tribal aggression. I gave my talk about the new geologic atlas. It was all fact-based, and I said, here's the risk that we know exists in the river valley, and this is why they're testing there. And it was just the facts and saying, good deal, everybody should test their well. And as soon as I was done speaking, one of the crop advisors stood up, and the little gal who was convening the meeting, Mindy, her name was, and he jumped up in her face and was pointing at her and said, why would you let someone come here and lie to us like that for 40 minutes? And he wanted to fight. And all 4 of those guys were the same way. They accused me of lying about the geologic facts. The Dunning-Kruger effect took over their lives. They could not tell the difference between competency and their incompetence. And the Yankees-Red Sox aggression triggered, that I was on the other side, so they were going to be aggressive. And this is when I really started thinking, well, geez, there's something, the facts aren't getting to these people. The facts aren't what we need to be talking about. And my advocacy is that the IKEs and environmental groups like this really start digging in to these social dynamic factors and understanding and training ourselves with the language and the recognition of what we do to address these. I just saw a speech from a professor from the University of Iowa in charge of their nitrogen management assessment in the state of Iowa, and I asked him, I said, they got a $20 million grant to do real-time nitrate testing in surface waters across the state, and I said, how much of your budget went to the social sciences? And he said, about 25%, but it should be 75%. We know the science. We're facing right now an environmental impact statement in the karst about the impact of nitrates. We know where the risk is. We know where the infiltration occurs. We know the consequence. But Monday night at the EQB board, we're going to have this argument, and we're going to hear, well, you can't prove it. You're not experts. And we're facing the same challenges that we have here, and it's neurobiology and it's bias that we're not equipped to address. Yeah.
Thank you for a great presentation. I'm a student of the social sciences as well as I am the ecological sciences. And we're starting an experiment up in Detroit Lakes, what we call civil conversation forums, where we agree to some norms,
Right.
Identify that we are in different tribes,
Right.
and then find ways to communicate with each other, not to try and convince the other one of a different point of view, but the goal is understanding. I will come to the EQB meeting on Red Wing. Mariah Levison's going to be there, and I understand she's going to try some civic engagement kind of experiment. So I'm very curious as to how well a state agency, I know the EQB is learning about civic engagement, and they're going in a good direction, and this is going to be an experiment. So I want to go there to participate and see what kind of techniques succeed in that widely divided tribal setting that they will have there, and see what comes of that. So I assume you're planning to be there.
I've got a ticket. I'll be there,
Okay,
and I'm very anxious to see how we can resolve this paradox that the people that are most affected are the ones creating the impact.
Jeffrey, thank you for your presentation today. I guess, we heard from Representative Hansen earlier an exact example of what is going on in our legislative process with tribalism, and the idea that you can't even bring up an issue without somebody saying, but the farmer. And I'm a farmer too. We have a small farm, and I live in southwestern Minnesota. And I guess one thing, we might be talking to the choir here, because we're all here because we care about water and we're interested in learning and constantly doing better. I would encourage you to listen to what Representative Hansen said, because if you know people that are in other parts of the state that are like-minded, oftentimes the people that agree aren't the ones that advocate.
Right.
It's only the people that complain and have the loudest voice. And a lot of our legislators in different parts of the state may have different mindsets about water or the environment. And whatever the issue is, we collectively across the state need to work together across networks and reach out to people that we know and encourage them to advocate from whatever part of the state they're from. Because the more demographics we have and the bigger the geography we have, the bigger our network becomes and the more powerful our network becomes. And I just really encourage you to do that, because it'll dispel some of the tribalism. And we need to do that. We need to collectively work together on that. It's really important, because we're hearing the same thread all day long as the challenges of moving good public policy forward. So please try to think about how you can reach out to whom you can maybe influence and encourage them to do so. Thanks.
Thank you for that comment, and I want to make a couple of comments about that in particular, because there is this issue that one of the communities that we identify around water is a tribal community. It's about feedlots, it's about pipelines, it's about mining. So we have to be careful. The scary thing about the social sciences to me has been, I recognize this in myself first. Right? And so how do you break those barriers once you see that this is your brain chemistry? These are the things that happen. I want to tell a story, though, and recommend a book. There's a book called The Choice Factory, 25 Biases That Influence Marketing. Marketing has this down. we're manipulated by these biases day in and day out by marketing, and it lists 25 of these biases and how to break through those biases. And it's a very clever way to do this. And Rick Hansen told me a story a couple months ago about a meeting that he went to in Atlanta 2 years ago. He was invited with his credentials to go to a meeting with Syngenta about neonicotinoids. And it was a 3-day-long training conference that they were taking crop consultants from all over the country and training them to respond on questions about neonicotinoids. And he said the training came down to one sentence: why are you always picking on farmers? And that fuels on the guilt of the farmers and the biases across a wide spectrum that creates a tribalism among themselves and this division that is helping their commercial interests. That was a very well thought out campaign to break that down to a simple response. People had to go away with only that one thought, and it is everywhere now. But as environmental groups, we're not doing the same thing. I don't think that we're out there saying, these are the things, these are the sound clips, these are the places that we can change a bias from a barrier into a motivator.
Jill asked me to introduce myself. I really want to thank you all. I appreciate being here today. My name is Peg Fershon, and I'm the Director of Programs and Operations at CURE. And we are a nonprofit in the Minnesota River Valley that does climate, energy, and water work. We've been doing it for 27 years now out of Montevideo, but we work all across the state, and we work nationally in our energy work and rural electric co-op reform. And I really just, this has been so helpful to hear what you're sharing, because being founded in water, we always, when we work with farmers, they look at us and think we're tree-hugging, kayakers. And we couldn't have a conversation with a farmer for the longest time. And about 7 years ago, we really went through a transformation, and we actually started working more about having conversations about soil health. Because we know that if the soil is healthier, the water's going to be better. Might not be perfect, but it's going to be better. Because since 1992, the Minnesota River Valley water quality has not improved. It's changed. What's polluting the river has changed, but the overall quality of the river is not improved in all these years. And it's been really hard to be optimistic and positive. And so the tribalism is there. We believe that family farmers can have conversations. You had it broken out really nicely on that slide about values and legacy. And so if we can have a conversation with a farm family about values and legacy, we can develop a relationship with them, and then we can talk about better ways to work the land and the water. But it's really hard for us to overcome the corporate agriculture and that mindset. So thanks for your presentation, Jeffrey.
Thank you. And just another comment about a recent piece of social work that was out of the Water Resource Center in Mankato here in Watawan County, and it was a survey of trust. It was asking farmers who they trust for advice about conservation. And they made a long list of groups that were trusted. The number one trusted factor was your family. You ask grandpa. Maybe not the most reliable source these days of conservation advice. The second was your crop advisor, the guys that are working on commission. And the third was the SWCD, the people that are getting you the money. At the bottom of the list was the PCA, the DNR, and environmental groups. And when they delved into that, people associated all of those as regulatory. So there's so much to learn from the social science about how we address these problems that we need to pay a lot more attention about it. And I'm a little shy about being a geologist up here talking about it, but it's been an epiphany to me.
My name is Gary Severson. I'm a retired history teacher at Bloomington Kennedy High School, so these are kind of my stomping grounds, a little further east. But, you know, tribalism is a good functional term, but I'm not so sure it shouldn't be hybridized in the sense that
That's a good point.
Alex Tocqueville said it was radical individualism that would destroy the country, which is kind of 180 degrees from tribalism. Now, maybe not, but in my mind at this point, it kind of seems to be. Now, I spent 15 years about 8 miles from where Ray Lindemann, who's the father of ecosystem theory, was born. I didn't know it at the time. But at the time, I took some students to Sleepy Eye, the Orchid Inn, the center of Brown County, to study conservative politics. And we walked into the ballroom, and there were 1,000 people who had paid $25 a piece, and all the speakers were from the John Birch Society. Radical individualism on steroids. Now, they may not call it that, but that's what they see in the, let's call it mythological farmer view of the world. I'm an individual. Nobody's going to tell me what to do about my water, my land, whatever. So this permeates our culture.
How that translates into group, in-group and out-group is a very important thing, and these are places where we do have to be really careful about the language, and that's not my expertise. Yeah. Up here. Peg.
Okay. You know, she said she reached an ability to, I have a teacher voice, she reached an ability to talk to quote-unquote opponents by coming to another subject with them. And I've been involved in water in Winona County now, in some very, very tough situations. And believe me, when you're living in a valley where Norwegian farmers have been living there for 200 years, they're not going to listen to you about something they don't agree with. But just serendipitously, we came together and started to listen and work with each other on a totally different subject. So I would encourage you not to just talk to people about water, but to get them to trust you by working with them on an issue you can find common ground on. And with us, it was the fire department for our township. Who knew? And now we have a different relationship. We're developing trust. I'm not going to say they believe me, but they listen to me. They don't shout me down.
Thanks. Okay, we need to get Alex up and loaded.
Just our tagline again: test your water, protect your family, know your water, and that may be the entry point to have these discussions. Thank you. Oh.